Stefanos. Thank you for talking with us today. You're now in Seoul. You've just been in Hong Kong making a movie about Filipino workers in there. The more I sort of speak to you and learn from about what's going on, there's very much a multicultural approach. It doesn't seem unicultural or just one location, but you're bringing everything together with identities. Just as we begin this conversation, can you tell us perhaps a little bit about who you are, where you've been, and what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me, and I'm excited for the questions. I mean, it's a multicultural film because Hong Kong is a multicultural place. And then I am also multicultural in that I was born and raised in New York, but my mother's from Greece and my father's first generation Chinese American. So I always had that sort of contradiction inside of me, sort of bumping around. And then going to Hong Kong, the people that inspired me the most were not the other Americans I had met or even the Hong Kong local people. It were these women, these domestic workers. And I instantly just thought that they were the most incredible people. And I wanted to find out more about their lives and their stories. And I also wanted to bring that story back to the US, back to places where we don't really know that this phenomenon exists. And, obviously raise awareness is an important thing, and not ignoring the struggles that these women face was a key thing for us. But I also wanted to show, hey, my friends back in New York, these women have figured something out that maybe we haven't. They are literally dancing with their struggles, and they are showing such grace in the face of everything. And many of them have very tough lives compared to people in New York, at least. So I thought there was a magic there, and I wanted to make that widely seen.
I love the dancing and that overcoming of struggle through dancing. It's very Nietzschean. Before we get to those Filipino workers and their lives in Hong Kong, I want to ask you about your own identity, because these days in the West, who we are, where we're from, our identity on this intersectional spectrum is a huge part of some people's conversation. Was your own identity, your heritage, your father's Chinese American background, your mother with her Greek heritage, was that a motivation to go and explore different multicultural identities and heritages elsewhere, Stefanos?
Definitely. And I think, to put it simply, I think even in a place like New York, which is very cosmopolitan, if you're not sort of the classical idea one has of American, which different ideas for different folks, I guess. Let's put it this way. I never felt fully American. I never felt I looked that way. I was never really treated that way. And even if I was, New York is such a bubble anyways. It's nothing like the rest of the country, as you know. So I always knew that there was more out there, and I was always very curious about that. I had grown up going to Greece a lot, so I had more interacted with that side of my heritage. But the Chinese side, the first place in Asia I went was Hong Kong. My father doesn't speak Chinese. He's born in the US, so it's a bit more distanced and separated from me. And I really wanted to connect with that. But then, I never thought that if you had told me 5 years ago that I would have such a connection to Filipino people and culture, I would have said, oh, interesting. I wonder why that would happen. So in one sense, identity has pushed me to leave the US, to go find stories elsewhere, to find culturally complex stories that are not simple, and to sort of break those stereotypes too. Because in Hong Kong, there's so many stereotypes about the domestic workers that I wanted to bust. But then in another sense, the connection I felt towards these Filipinos was inexplicable. I couldn't rationalize that from my Greek or my New York or my Chinese roots. It just felt like a matter of the soul. And it felt like, maybe it's dance. My parents were dancers. That probably plays a part. I wish I could say I am, but their spirit felt so attractive to me and so matching with me and my values, and I'm a very expressive person. I'd like to think that if I was them, I'd be dancing through my days as well. And so it was almost a deeper that inspiration was in a way outside of identity, even though on the surface, my identity definitely drew me to the situation of the story.
So it wasn't so much the identity, but it was that feeling, it was that connection, it was that emotion that you shared with people, their perspective on life that drew you to these people, and then to make a movie about it. Isn't it somewhat fascinating that you went to Hong Kong and then made a movie about Filipino people in Hong Kong? It wouldn't be the first logical step, and maybe that's what makes it interesting. But have you thought about the idea that you went to Hong Kong and then made a movie about non-Hong Kongese people in it?
Yeah, and I don't even, to be honest with you, I don't know how that happened. It just sort of, it miraculously took shape. It was a perfect storm. It wasn't just, I was making commercials. I was trying to find ways to be more creative than I was able to on the job. They were the most creative people I saw in Hong Kong by far, and I think they're the most talented people in Hong Kong, period. And I think it's a massive tragedy that's not recognized. And all the performers in the film, they are always called non-professional. We hear that a lot. Oh, with a cast of non-professional. And I'm just thinking, who gets to decide what that means? Because they're better than many professionals I've worked with. And yet there's so few roles for them. Nobody wants to hire Filipino talent in Hong Kong. Maybe it's better elsewhere. But yeah, it was almost like the film chose me. It sounds so cheesy, but I didn't. I just went with my gut, and it took me where it's taken me.
And it's a beautiful thing. And one of the reasons I like about it, and at Asia Society, it's about, building bridges between communities, understanding people more, sharing stories, because that brings us closer together rather than separating us and dividing us. Can you perhaps give us some idea of what position Filipinos play, or what position they hold in Hong Kong society? How are they treated? I mean, I know it's hard to speak of every single person, and there might be some element of generalization, but for those of us who are not as familiar with Hong Kong culture or society there, is it socio-economic? Is it based on ethnicity? Where in society are these Filipino workers sitting and existing?
First of all, just thank you for that question, because I think it's so nuanced, and I wish people recognize that more, because you get a lot of black and white. A lot of people want you to say, oh, Hong Kong people are terrible, Filipino people are all saints, and it's not so simple, of course. So it is a general, anything I say will be something of a generalization. But what I observed was that the concept of, and maybe you would agree, the concept of class is much more out in the open in Hong Kong than certainly in New York. Class is everywhere, obviously, but I noticed that people would openly talk about their class, and they would say, oh, I forget the words that they would use, but you got the sense that class was a more normalized part of life. People belonged to a class. Maybe your class was above theirs or below theirs, but you didn't really move around that much. You could try, but it didn't seem like anyone felt this was a major injustice. And I'm American. We have this, American dream, at least, idealistically. And I felt that the way that these Filipino women were being treated, the way I would observe, was that they were just looked at as service people, just there to help. No one bothered to really think, generally, of course, there's many people who treat them with respect, but nobody really cared about their lives, and no one wanted to know about their families. And it was just, what can you do for me? You can take my kids to school, you can cook, you can clean. That's all we really need from you. Of course, there are instances of terrible abuse, and then there's instances of close family, modern families, you could call them. And I thought that above all, they were not being recognized beyond their job descriptions. It was only just about my helper, my helper, my helper. Did you treat your helper well? Did you fire your helper? Did you get a new helper? Almost like they were kind of glorified Roombas or something. It's like they're just there to help your house, and you don't want to break it, but you don't want to, it's not something you need to give attention to. That's how they were being treated in my experience. And I thought that was really unfortunate because I just saw their talent. You know, I didn't have a domestic worker working for me. So all I saw was their amazing dancing. And everyone else just seemed to walk right past that and ignore it.
With this, it's so fascinating to hear you talk about class, and maybe sometimes in the United States a reluctance to talk about class, and maybe that's why things here in South Korea, why Parasite and Squid Game resonate so well over there, because they allow these class conversations to take place in a society that's just far removed enough for them to make it comfortable to discuss. There is that idea. You've spoken very much about the problems experience, the lack of recognition, perhaps the dehumanization, comparing them sometimes to automated or robot cleaners that do things in a house. When I watched this movie, and I'm struggling with words, movie, film, documentary?
Whatever you prefer, film, movie.
Art, yeah, okay. When I watched this, I was left with a feeling of positivity, though. I think it would be very easy. We see a lot these days about sort of grief merchants, packaging grief and emotion and selling it and playing on people's heartstrings. And we know that resonates a lot on social media. Yeah. We know that grips. But when I watched what you created, Stefanos, despite what you've told me, I was left personally with a feeling of joy, warmth, positivity, and love. It was kind of a little bit complicated and nuanced, but overall, that's what I got. What's your assessment of that? Is that what you were aiming for?
Yes, I agree with that. And I would say that the coverage of them, that's another angle to this. All the coverage I've seen of them, 99% of it is very sort of formal in tone. And it's almost like you're reading a human rights report. And it's almost, even though it's well-meaning and it's necessary, that type of coverage can often dehumanize in its own way by converting people into just statistics and problems that need to be solved. My first reason for wanting to tell this story was a positive feeling of inspiration. I felt I had seen something beautiful and something graceful. And I wanted to capture that. But I also think that one of my actors said this recently in a Q&A. They are the most resilient people on earth, and they always find a way to smile. You cannot break these people. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I thought that even though the film, it's not your Hollywood happy, like everything's perfect at the end of the day, I thought it was necessary to show it in a, it is positive. They are positive people in my experience dealing with them. And I wanted to be faithful to that, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It isn't Hollywood, but there is that positivity. And we are creating narratives and identities in our discourse. I was struck by an idea, Stefanos, a couple of years ago, which I've been living by as much as I can, which is not to talk about people, but rather to talk to people. It's very easy to do the former, much more uncomfortable to do the latter. Can you perhaps, we don't have any of the actors here in this conversation, but can you, through your own eyes and lens, introduce us to some of these actual people? Like who they are, like what they look like, what do they eat at lunchtime? I don't know, however you just best want to present them, but can you perhaps bring one or two of these actors from your film alive for us? Absolutely.
So, I mean, and they all have their own stories, which are really amazing. Miles, who's our lead, Miles Sible, I've never met an actor who's so instantly like impressive, right? Her range is incredible. She's been acting as long as she can remember, performing, singing, everything. And she can somehow turn on a dime from, a crying, weeping performance to like comedy. Like, I don't know how she does it. She has amazing control, for a non-professional, I guess, which just means someone who doesn't get a million roles. What she's told me is that she's had to sort of act on and off over the course of her life. She's the older sibling. She's obviously had to work. And so it hasn't been easy for her. When we were shooting this film, I knew I wanted her to act. She was working as flight crew for Cathay Pacific, and she had just started that. and she wasn't going to be able to take time off, and it was really hard to look for other actors. In the end, Cathay, COVID came and Cathay canceled all the flights, so she had this moment, and she, I was obviously thrilled by that, but she seized it. And we had a lot of conversations about her own family and life in the Philippines versus Hong Kong. She's obviously not a domestic worker herself, but she is in that community. She's grown up with them. She's gone to church with them and sang with them every weekend. And so she was very much invested in telling the story right. And I think in many scenes, she had people in mind, other than the people that I had met and written their little bits and pieces into the script. I could see that she was acting for people she had known. And I thought that was beautiful. And I thought that's where the authenticity came from in her performance. And even now, like, the film has had some limited amount of success and she's gotten a bit more of attention, but still she still tells me that she gets called for castings in Hong Kong and she has to say no to some of them just because she wouldn't be comfortable doing a sort of one-dimensional, like, silly maid trope that they always want her to do. And in Hong Kong, really, almost all the roles for Filipinos are domestic worker roles, which is a whole nother discussion, right? And so, Miles was one of the first people who I think of, obviously, because we just shot so many days with her, more than all the rest. Saiza, who's the co-star, Saiza Kada, is single mother from the Philippines. And she put so much of her experiences raising her son alone in this film. I shouldn't say alone. She had her parents to help, obviously. But just to see, there was one moment I remember very clearly where that scene where she's playing guitar, and it's quite an emotional scene. Her character is talking about her son. That clicked right away with Saiza. And I knew on that scene that we would just need to make the room quiet, and we would just need to press record, and we'd say action, and I would not give any direction. It would just be like that, let's do it again if we need. But it all came from her. And those were some of the most fun scenes to shoot because they felt so real. It felt like they weren't even acting. And maybe she'd tell you the same thing. And lastly, I'll tell you about the 4 friend characters. So Kaya, Anna, Vinya, and Marie. They're all different. They live in Hong Kong. Some of them are instructors of dance, and they all just took time off to do this and poured their heart into it. Again, they are called non-professional left and right, and yet as soon as the first rehearsal we had, I immediately knew that they would be able to do everything. And so it was, I'm very, very grateful to have met these people. And I met a few of them, and then they introduced me to others. They all are now very good friends. Some of them were friends before we even shot. And I do hope that they felt they were doing something for their own community by making this film.
I was actually going to specifically ask you about that, Stefano. Was there a sense from Miles and Saiza that they were not just playing a role in a movie? They weren't just presenting a character, but rather they were sort of carrying with them the responsibility to represent a community and then try to portray that in a light. Was there that sense going on, or was it just a movie?
I think it was only that sense. I think if they didn't have that feeling, they wouldn't have done it, honestly, because it's not like we have a lot of money to pay people, and they'll be the first to tell you I can be stubborn as a director. It's long hours. It's a lot of time commitment, rehearsals, and then, you shoot it, get the images, and then you have to record the audio because it's a photo montage. We did all these audio recordings in the studio. Little things too. I would say they would improvise a line and I would send it to them later, the audio, and I would say, how would you best translate this to English? I know what it means, but for a subtitle, what would be the right way? And now obviously we're traveling with the film and they've been there for that. They have been so involved from day one, casting everything. And I think it's definitely not for financial gain, and it's definitely not to do me a favor. I think if anything, it must be the fact that they feel like they're carrying a responsibility and they want to do it properly. And that warms my heart because I needed to gain their trust to show them I'm not just a foreign journalist, let's say, trying to make a really sort of surface level piece. I'm trying to really get under the story. And also I'm trying to show the story from a new angle, from a more empowered angle.
And it's fabulous the way this is represented, because it does feel like a community. It feels like a collection of people in that. I want to ask you, maybe before we go into some of the film's techniques and plots, you've just mentioned photo montage and some of the dynamism of the acting from Miles in particular. Before we get to that, you mentioned that... is it Sizer, the single mother, and her church going and things like that. From a South Korean perspective, many of the Korean diaspora that went to the United States, they would find communities in churches and things like that. So I'm just curious about, is it in that community, the Filipino workers in Hong Kong and more broadly, does religion play a big role? Is it a role on the side, or do you have any observations on that, Stefanos?
I think it's definitely it does play a big role. Sunday, it's funny because on Sunday, there's a sort of clear pattern. You know, if you're Google Maps and you're tracking the size of the crowd, let's say, or traffic or whatever it is, on a Sunday, you'll see that there's a lot of activity in the morning. So everyone's leaving their homes very early, 6, 7 a.m. Everyone goes to church. And then from like 7 to 9, it feels pretty quiet in the city. And if you had just been told that the domestic workers are dancing on Sunday, but if you went in the morning, you would not really appreciate it because they're all in church. And then obviously then they finish and then they come out and then they spend the rest of the day there. So I would say it's a big part of that routine for them. But I would, the times that I've been to church with them, it didn't really feel like church as I have known it in Greece or in the US. It felt much more social, and it felt much almost, I don't want to say, like kind of more down to earth in a way. Obviously the Philippines, there's a lot of Catholics, but it did feel like many folks were going just to see their friends. And I loved that. And it felt more fun, to put it very, simply, I guess. If there was more dancing, there was more singing, there was more eating. It wasn't just sitting in a dark room and reciting the Bible. It felt a bit more celebratory. And I think it needs to, because their Monday through Saturday is largely inside a tiny flat in Hong Kong. You've got to make the most of your Sundays, so you can't be stuck indoors too long, I think.
I really like hearing that part of it, Stefanos, because most of our associations with religion today are very pious or very strict or very fundamental people, sometimes people that might even seem a little bit dangerous or dogmatic, in our current climate. But, this is... I don't want to say religion done well, but these are people that go to church, have a community, and then everything you just said, with the dancing, with the beauty, with the joy. Probably one more question about the environment before we go to some of the film techniques.
Sure.
You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is also in Hong Kong. And now this is, we can talk about power, we can talk about British imperialism, the Opium Wars, control of Hong Kong and things like that. For the last couple of years, we've seen, questions about democracy in Hong Kong and where that's going, and free speech and protections and rights. What's been your understanding of that from your time there? Can you give us some insight into ground level Hong Kong life? Is this, are we talking about politics that doesn't really affect the day-to-day existence of people, or is this coming down into the routines of people?
I would say it is, from my observations. I must admit, I was relatively ignorant to the Hong Kong-China dynamic until 2019, when the protests started. And obviously, the reason for that was I was more interested in Filipino stories than the local stories. But then the protests consumed all of our lives. There was almost more than COVID in a weird way. COVID has lasted quite long, but for that 6-month period, the second half of 2019, it was every day. Your life was planned around the protest. Whether you're protesting or avoiding the protest, or whether you like it or dislike it, you were in it. Hong Kong is so small, you couldn't avoid it. Of course, the biggest protests were on Sundays, also the day off for many of these domestic workers. Now you have basically a pressure cooker where it's already crowded, and you have Central in Hong Kong, one neighborhood. You've got protesters and riot police and tear gas, but also thousands of domestic workers. And it was like so much activity in one area. But no one was talking about it from the domestic worker POV. It was always American point of view, Chinese, Hong Konger, what's the Hong Konger identity, which totally varies depending who you ask. But nobody ever thought, hey, did some group of people lose their only place and time to be free, essentially? And then, this idea of freedom, there was, it's so complicated, and it's also so nebulous, this word freedom, I think. And I saw so many young people in Hong Kong fighting for freedom politically. I wondered, after having done so much research on the Filipinos in Hong Kong, how much of that is, how there's levels to freedom, I suppose, and are these people who are fighting for political freedom depriving someone else in their homes of a more basic form of freedom? Certainly some of them not. Maybe some of them practice what they preach, many of them, I'm sure. But it just was ignored. No one really cared. No one was talking about it from their point of view. They're foreigners just like me. They're guests. They lacked certainly the American privilege that I had, the second I got off the plane. But they still are, in a new place. Even though many of them have been there for decades, they're still in a new place, just trying to navigate the same way I was. And I thought it was interesting to take it from their point of view, as it, since it's happening next door, it's like right there for them.
And what an environment in which to make this movie, the midst of a global pandemic, with the democracy protest, and then trying to tell this story while this is all going on. They say hard times make good art, Stefanos, and maybe that's what you've done.
Hopefully. I hope so.
I want to speak a little bit now about this movie that you've made. And for anyone listening, I'm going to try not to talk too much about the plot, because I want to encourage people to go and watch it for themselves, and also not to give away spoilers or things like that. You don't want someone to tell you about a book before you read a book, right? You have to experience it for yourselves. So in that sense, I want to ask you about some of the techniques. And it's a movie about dancing, and there's loads of dancing, and I was well prepared because I watched the movie RRR recently, which is a Bollywood movie, loads of dancing, so I was really primed for this. But when the dancing is not happening, there's conversations taking place. The plot is moving forward. This happens in like a stop motion animation. Maybe if anybody listening, if you sort of did pictures on the end of a paper and then you flicked it like that and things would move, that's how the conversations were taking place. And when I was first watching it, I thought my file had stopped, or there was a problem with my computer. I genuinely did. I was like,
and
what's going
on?
I'm glad I'm not the first. But the conversation takes like this. It reminds me a little bit of an animation, a cartoon, perhaps a bit of Thunderbirds or Puppety. What was the purpose of presenting the conversations like this? Was it out of necessity? Was it an artistic direction? Was it meant to show us something, like symbolically? Why have the conversations take place like this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's a few reasons. Oddly enough, the only reason you listed that's not a reason is out of necessity. Which I get a lot of questions of sort of, did you not have enough film or something? You needed to take photos, and it's nothing to do with that. It was a decision largely based on, to be honest, just the need for us to do something different. We can't compete with Disney and Marvel and large movies. We don't have that money. We don't have star power. We just don't have that distribution. And so we needed to do something different if we're going to be noticed at all. But we don't just want to do something different for its own sake. We want to do something a bit more, something original, I suppose, and something fitting for our story. And early on in the conversations I had in research, I kept hearing this word trapped. And so many women felt trapped, not just in the homes that they work in 24/6, but just in their general lives. Many of them are working for years, decades, sending all their money back, so they don't see any of the fruits of their labor. Sometimes that money is gambled away and lost, or misinvested, or even when it's used properly, you buy some land, you buy a house, you send your child to school, but you're not there for it. You don't really get to see it, other than a few weeks every few years. And so that intense feeling of being trapped was one that I thought, if we can find a visceral and more direct way to give that to an audience, it would be difficult, because no one likes to feel trapped, but also perhaps more profound. If it can make you feel it in a more profound way, that would make me satisfied. But then the flip side of that is, how do you represent that? How do you show that there is this brief day in the week, which goes by way too fast, where they can let everything out, all the joy and the pain, all at once, out through the dance? And that was motion for us. So the film, as you've said, alternates between that photographic photo montage of, you want the images to move, but they just won't. It's uncomfortable. Many people wonder if their internet is broken. It's always, of course, better experience than a cinema, but it's challenging, right? It's not what we're used to. And in a way, it's like a graphic novel where you have sort of just like thumbnails almost. In a way, it's like a book, right? Because you've got to fill the blanks in. You have A and B, but you don't know how A goes to B. And I like that. I like that people are forced to do some work. And I've tried to make it palatable enough that you are rewarded for the work, I hope. So you put in the work, and then there are these moments of release where you can sort of settle back into your traditional movie-going experience. But I do think, the people who come speak to me are usually the ones who like it. So I don't want to say everyone likes it, because that's definitely not the case. But it is nice to know some people get it, and some people see that I'm trying to put you in their shoes, if you will, a bit more directly. And so that was the main reason, I would say. There's a few other small reasons why we decided to do it this way.
It's fantastic that you're trying to do something different, but also you've admitted it, and I like it. Put the audience sometimes ill at ease, make them work, don't spoon feed them. There's this, I'm not quite sure who it's attributed to, but there's a fabulous quote that I love, which is, art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And I like that, because I was uncomfortable, I was disturbed. But you also draw attention to your techniques while you're doing this stop motion that looks a bit like a webtoon, but then you're showing clocks sort of pausing, showing that fracture of time. You're drawing attention to women saying we have to pause and things like this, and it feels very meta and self-referential and things like that. So you're telling people, we know this is happening and you have to experience it too. Was there an influence for this, or more broadly, because you said you're not trying to make a Disney or Hollywood, budgetary constraints and things like that, but you're an artist, you have influences, you bring things to you, or bring things with you. What influences are you bringing into this? What inspiration?
Great question. The most direct and obvious example is Chris Marker's La Jetée. The old short film. I saw that, I think I was 16 or 15 when I saw that in like a high school film class. 30 minutes, black and white, all stills. It's sci-fi, so it's quite different in tone and messaging. But I remember, I think I might have fallen asleep, or either I fell asleep or I hated it. And at that young age, I wasn't ready for it. But then somehow it had stayed in my mind. And years later, I was thinking, what was that film that was really sort of hauntingly different? And, you can't forget it, even if you don't like it. And then I watched it again, and I thought it was brilliant. The way that stills turn into motion just once, I think, is so beautiful in that film. I wanted to take that approach, modernize it as much as I could. Vastly different tonal treatment, right? Our story is very colorful. It's not sci-fi at all. And I wanted to just build on, Chris Marker's a genius, so I shouldn't say that, but I tried to build on his, I guess, discovery, which is that after your brain gets conditioned to still images, when you see motion, it's like you're there. It's just extra immersive. And it feels like they, the Lumiere brothers, when they filmed a train, or it might not have been the Lumiere brothers, but whoever filmed a train with the first experiments in cinema, and they played it in the cinema, and people started running away because it felt so real. They thought they were going to get hit by the train. That's how I felt when stills turned to motion, and I wanted to just see all that I could squeeze out of that discovery in a very different story, and also in a longer timeline. But it was a big question: can 90 minutes be sustained in still images? Some people would say no, some people would say yes, but I am happy that people talk about it, and people seem to. I've gotten a lot of comments that it's staying with people, and I think that's a useful, and I'm proud of that. That whether you like it or don't like it, usually you'll remember it, I think.
And from my perspective, what little it might matter, I enjoyed seeing something different. I wasn't 15-year-old Stefanos that had the opportunity to see that classic and then maybe fall asleep to it. But for me, this was a new experience. I didn't have a frame of reference of stop motion or this technique, and so I applaud you for showing me something new. And that's harder and harder to find these days, I would suggest. Now, you said 90 minutes of this technique might be difficult. I might go along with that, but it wasn't 90 minutes because it was interspersed with these fabulous dance scenes. And I didn't watch the movies perhaps that you watched, but I grew up watching movies like Breakdance and things like this, these 80s movies and I was getting elements of that, but when I was watching these dance scenes, you can hear the characters laughing, which I just found fascinating, because it wasn't dance with this super serious or sexy. It was very good. We've already talked about, is it professional or amateur? No, it was good, but it was also filled with sounds, human sounds. Can you tell me a little bit about like the decisions or how you portrayed then, in contrast to the still images, these fluid dances that keep coming back?
Absolutely. And I think what you've said is very true. It's not really 90 minutes of stills, because that would have been tough. And so what we've done is, okay, still images are a bit difficult to watch sometimes, especially for especially if you walk into that theater having no idea that it's a different film. That's where you get people who walk out, I would say, is when they just fully expect a normal film. And it's shown me a lot about how much expectations are important, and trailers and all that sort of things. But I think dance is the easiest and most natural thing to watch on screen. And I think it says what words cannot. You don't need to explain it. And that's, look at TikTok. You just play a video of someone dancing. Even if they're not particularly good, it is captivating just to see a human being dance. And I knew that if we could just get people to make it to the next dance, somehow we'd trick them into watching the whole thing. And then they, at a certain point, I think people get invested. And once you're invested, it doesn't matter if it's in stills, it doesn't matter if it's dance. I think you just want to know what happens to the characters. But as for the way that the dancing is treated in that sort of almost, I don't want to say documentary, because the dances are staged, but it's not like Step Up where you have 10 different camera angles of the same move and it's this sort of massive choreographed production. We do have choreography, of course, but it is meant to be fun, and it's also meant to show that they do talk while they dance. They laugh, they make fun of each other, they push each other around. It's not so serious. It's because it's not their profession, even though they're very good at it. This is ultimately a stress relief for them, and they do have to go back the next morning and go back to work. So while there are those domestic workers who do competitions, who take it very seriously, and many of them in the film who absolutely blow you away when you see their dancing, to the point that you don't believe that they're domestic workers. How could they be so good with one day every week to practice? But then the spirit of the characters, I knew was important. And to be honest, it was my actors. They just talked and joked while they were dancing. We recorded it. It was much more interesting than just playing the dances verbatim. And I think it's that just boils down to their culture. And I think it's the most beautiful and entertaining thing.
To be completely honest with you, I was surprised by the quality of the dancing. I don't want to go into them too much, but I saw the first one, and as they were continuing, the choreography and the lines that they were doing, some of the moves, and I was like, wow, this is actually very good. I'm sorry if that sounds rude of me to be surprised, but it was a genuine reaction. And I think what I loved about it, a lot of dance these days, I'm in Korea, and so a lot of the dance is very highly stylized, choreographed, and there's very little room for interpretation or individuality. Now, I love watching James Brown videos and things like that, where it was far freer. And I see in these dances, it's not just about doing the moves, but that's where the real sort of personality comes out. And it's weird because the personality comes out almost when they're not speaking, when the story is not being told, but you feel the energy of these people, of who they are as individuals, more so when they're dancing than when they're telling you a story. And that's counterintuitive, isn't it?
Definitely. And that's what that is true in real life, I would say too, where I would learn more about the domestic workers I befriended sometimes by dancing with them than speaking with them. You would see like who's shy, who's the jokester of the group, who's the one who really wants to get better at dance, who's the one who is who likes me, who doesn't like me, right? And I could see that it says, we've written the story so that the dances are like scenes, essentially. Information is conveyed during the dance. H and Sapa, the two leads, they meet. A big discussion was, should they have a conversation or should they dance first? And we had these two scenes, you might remember, and we weren't sure the order. And I always thought it's much better to have them dance first, because I think it paves the way for a more deep conversation in a more realistic way. And it also felt like that's how it does and could happen, where you have two groups of friends, oh, I like the music you're playing, let's dance together. You meet people via dancing. You don't sit down and have coffee and ask about their life, right? It's much more through the dance, I suppose. And so we've left things out of the dialogue that are meant to be shown in the dance. H and Sampa's whole sort of falling into romance together, that doesn't happen at all through words. That really just happens through the dance, and then it's almost like they're it's like they've known each other forever after dancing once. And I thought, that was just amazing how that happened in real life first, I would say.
The power of music, absolutely, and dance. Before we get to music and language, Stefanos, I just want to jump back, because you said with this stop motion that some people find it uncomfortable, and that is the power of expectations and trailers and like my experience as well. Have you had any decisions about whether it's better to inform people of what they're going into or whether to hold it back? My personal decision would be don't tell them anything. I love going into things blind, because that's what I want. Where's your mind on that? Are you going to change how it's presented in terms of that information, or just keep it secret?
I think what I've been doing now is just telling people sort of like a coy, like, get ready, different, just something like that. I definitely don't say, it's a photo montage, so it's still images. I try not to explain that, because I do think that first moment in the beginning of the film where it goes to stills is a shock to the system, even for me. And I know exactly when it's coming. I'm like, whoa, this is what just happened to my movie. It also depends where you see it. So I think in a theatrical setting, you don't really think it's broken. And it gets down to the details. If there's subtitles that are continuing over the stills, no one thinks it's a Wi-Fi issue. But if I send it to someone who I think, for whatever reason, expects it to be more mainstream, I'll just say, let me know what you think. It's not what you expect, and I can't wait to hear like how you honestly feel about it. And I honestly enjoy hearing the critiques more or as much as the compliments, because that's when you really see like what didn't work. And I can change it still. It's never too late, right, to change some of the cuts. But it is the expectations do matter, and I think I haven't truly figured out if there's one way to do it, or if I just sort of tailor it based on how I feel. Yeah.
Probably for the best. I'm imagining myself now in a movie theater watching it and just like looking up at the projection guy, going, "Hey, what's?" I don't even know if they have projection guys anymore. Let's talk a little bit about language, Stefanos. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about other movies in this, but I'm just keeping it real. I recently watched Prey, which is a new Predator movie. It's a prequel, but it takes place with amongst the Comanche tribe, and so you have these different languages, and they eventually kind of settle on English. You know, there's this transfer of, well, obviously this is not, they weren't speaking English at this time. And how did you address the nature of the language being spoken, the use of subtitles? Because it's multicultural. From my experience, here's me as a British man in Korea watching a film about Filipinos in Hong Kong. There's all of this going on that you need to try to convey. How did you come to your decisions in terms of language and subtitles?
You'd be surprised how many people ask me why I didn't do it in English. And the simple answer is they don't speak English with each other. They speak Tagalog or Taglish, and maybe it's a personal thing. It kind of bugs me, even for like period pieces, or like it's when people are speaking English in a story that they wouldn't be speaking English, it does feel a bit, okay, it's not really very authentic. I get it for certain moments. I do think there's you're making a movie for an audience. You're not making it as just like a pure historical record, I suppose. We're not actually anthropologists, even if we are anthropological in our approach. So I think it was always important to do it in Tagalog. The challenge is that I don't speak Tagalog or Chinese, Cantonese. So there's not that much Cantonese. There's a bit. But I knew that my cast cared enough, and were skilled enough to bridge my gaps in knowledge. It was tedious, but it was important to have that be accurate. Because I think the way that they, the sort of banter that they throw back and forth amongst each other is centered on Tagalog. They do it in English when they hang out with me as well, but I do feel like there's a lot you would lose, aside from the angle of authenticity, just from a pure quality of the dialogue aspect. You would lose a lot if it were in English. And I always wanted them to improv, so we basically just had guide rails on the scenes. We couldn't improv and then the scene goes in a new direction, because then it wouldn't make sense in the film. So we always knew the start and the end and the emotional arc, but I knew I needed to give them a lot of freedom, and they demanded the freedom, and they probably, I shouldn't say demanded, but they were clearly the ones who should have decided the individual lines in some of those scenes. Because it felt like you couldn't, when we're rehearsing the dances, the jokes that they're making to each other just in rehearsal, no one's filming it, they were so funny, and the energy was so contagious and so beautiful to watch, that I knew that I needed to let them do that if that's what they wanted to do. And then later I could figure out, will it be in the cut? What are they saying specifically in certain moments? But I think that if they weren't enthusiastic about making something for their community, it wouldn't have worked, because they really did all the heavy lifting on the Tagalog dialogue.
I applaud the use of language. Perhaps it's living in a different country for so many years, decades even, that I'm used to it. I know some people abroad, they just want dubbed versions. They can't handle subtitles. But I think the world is changing, and more of us are overcoming that 1-inch barrier that director Bong has talked about. And so I applaud you for doing that. I'm a big musician, Stefanos, and I was curious about the music in your. I never went back and Googled it, and so I wasn't sure. But there weren't many tracks that I recognized. So are we talking original music composed for it? Was it selected, or how was the music placed in this?
A variety. So the score, some of the biggest pieces, and the soundtrack, if you will. So not the pop songs, I guess. The score was original. We had a composer, Bill Yang, who's really, really talented, and he felt the story from the very beginning. The tracks that they're dancing to are sourced, and we had to get them early because we couldn't afford big, fancy, name recognizable songs. But we did find some songs we liked, and we found they're very catchy, and we knew that we could do dances to them. But obviously we needed to find them very early to start choreographing for them. So that was that was a long process, but it was done well ahead of the shoot. And actually we're really happy about that, because people I've gotten a lot of comments that people want to get up and dance themselves when there's certain moments. And I think the music is important for that, obviously. It has to be the right kind of music. But also we wanted to show a variety of styles, because a lot of people think that they're just doing this sort of Zumba dance, exercise dance, but it's not true. They do ballroom, they do waltz, they do hip hop, R&B, bachata, Latin dances. They do everything, right? Ballet even. So I wanted to show off that range that they have as well, and not just stick to the sort of expected casual dance that they're sort of known for, because they are much more talented than people realize.
I feel slightly relieved that I'm not that out of touch yet. I was watching the movie going, I don't know any of these songs. Am I that old that I know nothing? Yeah. But now I know it's an original score and some source music. Thank you for putting me at ease.
Yeah. That's all the hottest new tracks, David.
If they must be hot if I don't know them. We've talked about some of these techniques. If we just talk about maybe some theme or idea, and that would be I'm going to put them all together, I think, but sexuality and gender and how this comes across. At the start of our conversation, we talked about how identity, your own explorations, and that taking place with these Filipino community in Hong Kong. Gender, sexuality in this, was there a message you were trying to get across? Was there something that you were trying to look at, to address, to try to draw attention to, perhaps, Stefanos? Sorry.
To be honest, I was just trying to sort of recreate what I had seen in the way that I had seen it. You've got a community of 200,000 Filipino women. I think it's 99% women. And another 200,000 Indonesian women. And that's just Hong Kong, right? And you would see a lot of dancing that looked romantic and sexual in nature. And it looked like more than two friends dancing. But then you'd also hear of, I didn't want to make assumptions, because I would often think that I'm seeing a couple and then hear that they both have husbands back home. And one of them might even have a boyfriend in Hong Kong. And it was always, Hong Kong is also, as you know, a little bit conservative regarding this. So you don't see many same-sex couples out in the open PDA. That's not common. And so I never thought we could cross that line of showing something that wouldn't realistically be seen. But I also did see many of these sort of ambiguous relationships that seemed very beautiful and seemed very, there's a support network amongst these women, and there needs to be. They have difficult lives. They don't have their families with them. And I wanted to show that in a subtle way, I guess. I can't say I'm trying to say something too directly. There's no statement I'm really trying to make, other than to show it the way I saw it, I suppose.
That's quite refreshing, because we often consume media that feels like it's got a political agenda, that feels like it's didactic, like it's trying to teach us or to educate us, perhaps even to indoctrinate us in whichever message it might be. But with this, I didn't get one, so I wasn't quite sure. I didn't feel like I was being preached at any point during this. And to hear you say you were just representing or bringing to life what you saw without, you know, really trying to hammer home a message, that's a pretty cool thing, isn't it?
I hope so. And the other thing that what you've just said made me remember, we recently had a question that someone, more of a complaint than a question, but someone thought that the same-sex relationship depicted in the film wasn't relevant to the main storyline. So someone believed that the main story is H wants to escape. Why do you add this lesbian relationship? What is it helping with? And, you know, why does it not come to a bigger resolution or whatever? And my first thought was, many, many movies have a B story of a romance. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone say about a heterosexual couple, or, you know, the leading man having a romance with the leading woman in a movie that is about saving the world, let's say. No one ever says, oh, that wasn't really necessary for him to save the world. Why this is kind of a distraction. It's the most typical thing to have a B story as a romance. And only because ours is two women, I think, have people, so it becomes this thing of not every film featuring two women in a romantic relationship needs to be solely about that. And I think most people would agree and recognize that. So it's been a minority of voices that have said that. But I always think it's interesting because for same-sex couples to be fully normalized, they need to be shown in a normal way. We don't. Yes, it should feel refreshing. It should feel like we're not trying to talk about every single issue, for lack of a better, you know, that's a bad way to say it, I guess. But we were just trying to make something the way we saw it, and the way we saw it was very normal, I suppose.
One of my favorite representations of that I've seen in the past, and which I enjoyed seeing in your work here, Stefanos, there was an old television series called The Wire, and in that there was a character called Kima, and she had a lesbian partner, but it was so incidental to her character. It was just never played up as being special or different, just as if she had a male partner or something like that. You know, it was just treated, and I enjoyed that presentation because that normalizes it, and it doesn't other it. Probably we should try to bring this conversation somewhere near to a close, and so if there's anything that I haven't asked you that you're dying to say, in this time will be your time to say it. Can you give us the title? What the title means, because you know, I looked at it and I went, that's not grammatically correct. What's going on? And so the title, Stefanos, please.
Yeah, so I think it's funny because sometimes people they want me to explain, so what are they dancing for? Why do they dance? And you know, that is entirely up to the viewer to decide, I think. I have my beliefs on why they dance. Also, different people dance for different reasons, of course. But I think that's a good thing. I think we want people to watch this and ask themselves and talk with their friends, what does dance specifically represent to these folks on the film? Is it their release? Is it their is it just exercise? Yes, for sure. You know, it's just, you got to move your body if you're stuck in the house all week. But is it also something more? And I think the answer is yes, but I decline to say all the things that I think, you know, all the reasons I think they dance. But what seemed very, you know, to bring it back to a line in the film, what seemed to be always true was that dance was essential for them. Dance was a necessary part of their world. Dance was a way they communicate and the way they express their feelings and the way they release everything. And it was not, I guess the way it's said in the film is, most people dance to blend into a party. They move their bodies just to disappear. We are not like that. We don't dance for nothing. And that was a sentiment that really started the whole thing, because you can tell when someone's dancing for a trivial reason versus when someone is dancing because they need to dance. And I thought that was extremely, extremely beautiful.
That was a great line. I would have paraphrased it wrong. I'm glad you brought it up. But some people dance to blend in. And I finished that sentence in my head with some people dance to stand out. Perhaps the answer in this is what's that technique called? I'm showing is it a McGurkin or a MacGuffin or something where...
MacGuffin.
MacGuffin. So... where you don't know at the end of Lost in Translation what's being whispered or what's inside the briefcase. McGurk. There's a McDonald's placement ad for something. But yeah, so people will be able to interpret for what reason they might be dancing and bring their own interpretations to it, like they do with the gaps inside the stop motion. You're asking the audience to work a lot here, Stefanos.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. But it's also, I just lost my train of thought. I think I was going to say something about dance. It's essential to them, and it's I've lost it. I'm sorry.
No. I get that feel. It's the joy, the love, the reality, the personality, and the way you've brought all of that together in a very complicated is the wrong word, but unique way. It makes for a marvelous experience, I will say that. And so I'm really thankful for what you've done, and also introducing me to a community and a lifestyle and a group of people that I had no idea that wouldn't have been in my bandwidth, and now I'm thinking about them. So you've humanized some people for
Amazing.
me.
That's great.
Thank you. Is there any message? Is there anything that we should be doing? Is there anything that, do we go and share it on social media? Do we go and talk to someone in the street? What comes next for the people listening to this, Stefanos?
So it's going to be streaming later this year, probably around November, December. And we'll have a link for that eventually. But I guess for now, the thing, we'd love for people to find us on social media and keep up with us. We're showing it. We've just shown it in Korea and Philippines. We're going to go to Germany with it, back to the US, maybe UK as well. And so we want to, there's overseas Filipino workers everywhere on earth. And we've been absolutely delighted by the passion that they have in promoting this film, even when they haven't been to Hong Kong, or they're not domestic workers, or they don't know us really. And that has been very heartening, and we want to continue that. I'm working as hard as I can myself, just because I never thought it would get this far. I never thought we could make a movie, but I never thought we could make a movie that people care about. And I think that's a testament to our team, and also what we tried to do. I think our intentions were in the right place. And so I do think people respond when you can feel that the movie's for good. It's not just, and here's entertainment for you, right? But I think what I was going to say earlier, now that I remember, was you can't be invisible while you're dancing, I think. And many of these women feel so invisible in their lives. So maybe that's why they're dancing. And maybe the more we can just share footage of them dancing, the better it's going to be, I think. The more people will just humanize them. Of course, there's a million things I'd love to see happen policy-wise in Hong Kong, in the US, everywhere. I would never know how to accomplish that, and that's not my, I wish, but I can't. The most I can hope for as a filmmaker is that you will see them as human. You'll know that they exist, they're not invisible, and you will see them as fully human the way you might see your own friends and family. So that's really the most I hope for.
And that's beautiful, and that's where we can leave it. Thank you so much, Stefanos.
Thank you so much, David. This was amazing. I really enjoyed the questions.
Can I ask how you say thank you and I'll even get the name of the language, Tagalog?
Salamat po.
Salamat po. Okay. I say to you, salamat po.
Yeah. Thank you.